To the Point with Michael Williams.
Almost a year after last August primaries, there are claims of voter fraud, suspicions about absentee ballots, and questions about an investigation that did not lead to any suspects. Good morning and welcome. An investigation by our news partners at the Palm Beach Post revealed in one section of Palm Beach County there was an unusually high number of absentee ballots in the Democratic primary. The state attorney oversaw an investigation with more than a dozen detectives. No suspects were found. The case was dropped. Joining me now is the reporter who uncovered this story, Lawrence Mower with the Palm Beach Post. We thank you for coming in. And before we dive into the complexities here, I want to point out that we invited State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg to be on the broadcast, and his office said he's out of town. And one of the politicians mentioned in the Post story with a high number of absentee ballots is State Senator Bobby Powell. Lawrence reported that he called his story, quote, criminal. We'll touch on that in a moment. We invited him to be here, but he never got back to us. So, with that predicate, let me read an excerpt or two and then have you jump into it, if you will, Lawrence. You said in your article, detectives with the state attorney's office found clear-cut evidence of voter fraud with nearly 24 people's signatures forged on request for absentee ballots. But prosecutors are dropping the case. Why? They can't find a suspect. Pick it up from there.
Yeah, this story really goes back to August. In the August Democratic primary, there are three races: a state house seat, a state senate seat, and a county commission seat.
We're talking about Palm Beach County Commissioner Mac Bernard, State Rep Al Jaquette, and State Senator Bobby Powell.
Exactly. And their opponents in the race were noticing some weird things going on with absentee ballots, a high number of absentee ballots being requested in certain precincts. Supervisor of Elections Susan Bucher noticed people dropping off bundles of absentee ballot request forms, which was unusual. And that triggered an investigation with the state attorney's office. And they came out and found the 22 people's signatures had been forged on these absentee ballot request forms. And these are like paper forms, you know, that you need to send in, and you'll get an absentee ballot in the mail. You can also do it online, but in this case, it was just the paper forms. And one of the 22 people was actually a state attorney's office employee, and 3 of her family members. And all 17 of the 22 were centered in a narrow portion of Riviera Beach and West Palm Beach, in which all 3 of their districts intersect.
In which the districts of Powell, Mac Bernard, and Al Jaquette center. And by the way, your article points out, they described their efforts to get to the bottom of the allegations, talked about this tight-knit trio, as you wrote, of rising stars. They won their races by generating extraordinary turnout in absentee ballots. And again, 22 voters, 17 of whom were in all the districts, claimed their signatures were forged. But didn't Susan Bucher feel the number could be much higher? I believe your article touches on that as well.
Yeah, the number could have been much higher. There were also a number of other allegations that were made that people were these candidates were going around collecting ballots, which is, according to the state attorney's memo, is illegal. We did our own investigation into this, which was published back in March, and we found people who were, some of these people said that the candidates came into their homes and actually helped them fill out the ballots, which may or may not be illegal, but certainly crossed some ethical lines, people we talked to said. We also found, like, one blind guy said that that Mac Bernard had actually come into his home, filled out his ballot, not his request form, but his ballot, and signed it. And we went to the Supervisor of Elections office and looked at the signature on the ballot envelope, and yes, it was not that blind guy's signature.
You write, quote, detectives didn't follow up on basic leads, didn't interview people who might have known about the fraud, and waited 8 months before following up with voters who made complaints, according to memos that you uncovered. And they apparently did not question Powell, Bernard, or Jaquette.
Yeah, there's no evidence in the report that they questioned any of them. Their opponents in the race said they weren't asked any questions. They did find a person of interest, someone they called a person of interest, a guy by the name of Delano Allen, who was dropping off bundles of these absentee ballot request forms at the Supervisor of Elections.
Now talk about who he is.
Yes. Well, what they do not mention in the report, what detectives strangely do not mention, is that Delano Allen is Bobby Powell's longtime legislative aide. They tried to reach him. They talked to him on the phone for a few minutes, but apparently didn't follow up for several months, and by that point they could not reach him again, what they say in the report. It's unclear, but they never got a chance to interview him.
Does Bucher's office, do others believe there was a clear-cut case of fraud here, A? Yes.
Well, Bucher's office is not saying that. Nobody's really saying that
They're all dancing around the edges of it, but everything seems to point to that possibility.
Yes.
Or even likelihood, which?
Yeah, immediately after the election, their opponents were really crying foul. I mean, Bobby Powell's opponent in that race, Michael Steinger, had found affidavits from people who said that they had never requested ballots, and he turned them in. And if you look at the actual numbers, how many absentee ballots came in their favor? It was really defied all odds, and we talked to statisticians and stuff who follow these kinds of trends, voter trends, and they said that it seemed very suspicious. And I'll give you I can give you an example. Sure. You know, generally in elections, the bigger the race, so the more votes it gets. So, for example, the presidency, more people vote for the president than they do for the down ballot, you know, minor races and stuff like that. Well, in like a dozen precincts, these guys were getting more votes, far more votes than people at the very top of the ticket. I mean, the biggest race there was the U.S. Senate, Democratic U.S. Senate primary, and in one precinct, they got 135 more votes than all the candidates in that Senate race.
In the top of the ticket race.
At the top of the ticket, yeah. And these are not, I mean, even though these are, you know, relatively important seats, that our people we talked to said that seemed very suspicious.
At the end of the day, what did the politicians say to you? We know what Mr. Powell's saying to you about it. In fact, let's go to that. Mr. Powell said, he blasted it, called the reporting criminal, said it's distasteful, it should be criminal, the newspaper can print something like that and implicate. We should note that none of the politicians were mentioned in the memos. That's important to note.
Well, Bobby Powell was not mentioned.
Right.
In it. Yeah.
What do you say to that statement by Bobby Powell?
Well,
who we invited to be on the broadcast.
Sure, we were reporting on the actual memo and pointing out some of the problems in the state attorney's memo, which everybody we've talked to who is not affiliated with the campaign says, yeah, this memo is very, very strange, all the stuff it leaves out. He felt that, you know, because it doesn't name him, he says that he was never investigated, but, you know, you look at who benefited from all these absentee votes. It was, of course, him and Mac Bernard and Al Jaquette.
And what did Mr. Bernard and Jaquette say, if anything, to you?
They've never said anything. They've never answered specific questions to us. Al Jaquette has kind of said that this is we're kind of making this an issue because they're black, even though his opponent was black in that race. And Mac Bernard said that he didn't do anything wrong. He got this amazing turnout in absentees just from hard work.
Talk about the fact, Mr. Ehrenberg said there's nobody to pin this on, no suspect. Talk about your conversations with the state attorney's office.
Yeah, we've not had really any conversations with them at all about this. They've chosen not to comment on it.
So despite repeated requests. Where does it go from here?
Probably nowhere. You know, FDLE, I talked to FDLE, they said that they're not, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, who sometimes does do voter fraud investigations, they said they're not looking into it and have not looked into it. FBI probably would not. I've not heard back from them yet.
What about voter watchdog groups? What is the sense out there in the community from opponents, from voter watchdog groups and the like, who say, wait a minute, there might have been a smoking gun, but we don't seem to have gone far enough along the trail to definitively say either way? Yeah,
and at this point it's going to be kind of hard to make a case because, you know, they're relying on people in their homes who are recounting experiences that happened almost a year ago, right? Even though we found plenty of people to talk to in our March story, it'd be tough now, but voter groups are people we've talked to think that it smacks of a cover-up. Of course, these are Democrats. The state attorney's a Democrat. I'm not saying that was the motivation behind it. We don't know. But you know, State Attorney Derek Ehrenberg is, you know, rumored to be running for a congressional seat. That's the rumor out there. And, you know, I've heard a lot of chatter about how that might have influenced you know, the outcome of this investigation.
A lot of chatter, but we want to stress.
Yeah, we don't have no evidence. We have no evidence of that.
At the end of the day, for you and for those who you talk to and they're reporting for the story, how frustrating that this thing seems to be a lot of loose ends that have not been tied up one way or the other.
Yeah, you know, this is now the third absentee ballot fraud investigation, or absentee ballot fraud case, I should say, in the last 2 years. And in each one of those races, the people accused of the fraud have won the races, even though it was found out later that there was fraudulent activity in all these races.
Which begs the question, what are election supervisors and voter watchdog groups doing to try and make sure that they close these loopholes or this potential, again, not proven, no suspect named here, but close this potential for fraud?
Oh, we've seen nothing. In fact, in the last legislative session, Bobby Powell introduced a bill to make it easier to drop off absentee ballots, which I'm not clear if that's been signed by the governor or not, but it passed. There's really been no activity on this, despite all the outrage over voter fraud and stuff like this. I mean, in our investigation, about a third of people vote absentee in Florida now, and there's really no way to know that the person who requests an absentee ballot, fills it out, and turns it in is actually the voter. You know, when you go to a poll, you have to show an ID now. That's the rule now. But for absentees, the supervisor of elections is relying on a signature. Does the signature on the absentee ballot look close enough or similar enough to the one on record, the one they have on record? And when we started looking at some of these ballots, I mean, the blind guy's ballot was approved. We asked him to sign something, and of course it looked like a blind person had signed it, and meaning it was barely legible. But the actual ballot, it was in cursive, like anybody else would have signed it.
To those who argue, including...
And that was approved, yeah.
Including Mr. Powell and others, say there's nothing here. What do you say?
Well, I mean, there seems to be a lot of smoke. We probably won't get to the bottom of it now as far as in any criminal sense because of this investigation. But, our reporting showed that these candidates were going into people's homes, helping them fill out ballots. The state attorney's office found somebody was behind something and doing something that they shouldn't have.
Does your reportorial instincts, and you don't do editorials, but looking at the facts, looking at the investigation you did, looking at all the people you talked to, looking at what was said, and as importantly, some of what was not said to you, do you believe that somebody got away with fraud here?
I don't know enough to say. I mean, well, somebody obviously committed fraud. I mean, the state attorney's office...
That's unquestionable. It's pinning it on somebody.
Oh, yeah. There probably no charges will come of it.
And thus getting away with fraud on the most sacrosanct privilege we have, which is go to vote. And then, of course, again, begging the question that when the next election cycle comes up, are things tightened up or not?
That's a good question. We basically won't know.
Final thoughts?
It's amazing. I mean, there have been 20 people, just since 2010, who've been arrested for absentee ballot fraud throughout the state, including somebody just outside, a mayor just outside of Orlando a few months ago. And, this will probably continue to be an issue until something's done about it.
Were these enough votes to flip these elections?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Priscilla Taylor, she was the incumbent county commissioner. She actually soundly beat Mac Bernard at the polls.
And she said, quote, "We all felt there was fraud going on," a quote from former county commissioner Priscilla
she sent
Taylor.
out a mailer to everybody in her district saying, look, don't give your ballots to anyone because something really, I mean, there's so many eyes on elections that it was apparent to everyone running in the race that there was something really weird going on. But anyway, Priscilla beat him at the polls by almost 800 votes. But because he beat her by 1,200 absentee votes, he narrowly won the race.
You've raised a lot of questions, as you said, a lot of smoke out there. Whether it'll ever get resolved and cleared, we'll see. But we thank you for your reporting on a topic that should be of utmost importance to all of us when it comes to the sanctity of one person, one vote. And you've raised a lot of questions, a lot of troubling ones that right now do not seem to have sufficient answers from officials. Again, we invited a number of them to be part of this broadcast as well. At least thus far, they've declined. But thank you for shedding light on it for all of us.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it very much. Coming up next, Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act survived one major test but flunked another. Our roundtable takes on the political impact, the fallout now in Florida.